The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. Lucky Luciano, the most powerful man in organized crime, sat in his silk pajamas, in his penthouse, overlooking Central Park. The voice on the other end was shaking. "Boss, we got a problem in Harlem." Lucky's hand tightened around the receiver. He'd been expecting this call for months. Ever since Bumpy Johnson walked out of prison, the delicate balance he'd spent years building was cracking. Street corners that had been quiet for 11 years were suddenly buzzing with whispered conversations. But what Lucky didn't know was that in less than 72 hours, 3 words from Bumpy's mouth would force the most feared crime boss in America to do something he'd never done before: back down, completely. To understand those 3 words, you need to understand what Harlem meant. And this wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an economy. 15 square blocks that generated more cash per square foot than Wall Street. Numbers running, policy banks, juice loans, protection rackets. Money flowed through Harlem like water through a dam, and everyone wanted to control the spillway. On any given day, more than $50,000 changed hands in small bills and loose change. A parallel economy running alongside the legitimate world but operating by its own rules. No banks, no records, no tax returns, just cash, trust, and the understanding that certain people collected certain percentages from certain activities. Lucky Luciano thought he already controlled it. While Bumpy was serving 11 years in Alcatraz, Lucky had systematically moved his operation north of 11. Not with violence. Violence was messy. Lucky was smarter than that. He used economics. Instead of forcing anyone out, Lucky simply offered better deals, better terms to policy runners, lower juice rates to loan sharks, cheaper protection to nightclub owners. It was capitalism, applied to an illegal marketplace. Pay people more, treat them better, and they'll switch sides without a second thought. Slowly, quietly, he'd taken over 60% of Harlem's underground economy. But Lucky made one critical mistake. He assumed Bumpy Johnson was finished. Prison breaks men, especially prisons like Alcatraz. 11 years of isolation, of silence, of having your power stripped away piece by piece. Lucky had seen it happen to dozens of men. They went in as kings and came out as broken shadows.
Alcatraz wasn't just any prison. It was designed to destroy the spirit of men who thought they were untouchable. Most men emerged from the rock as hollow versions of themselves, their confidence shattered, their networks forgotten, their reputations buried under a decade of absence. Lucky was about to learn that Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. June 10, 1963. Bumpy walked out of Alcatraz carrying everything he owned in a brown paper bag. No welcome committee, no brass band, no fleet of cars, just one man, Illinois Gordon, waiting by a taxi at the prison gate. Illinois was 73, had been with Bumpy since 1931. And in all those years he'd never seen his boss look the way he did that morning. Older, yes, grayer, definitely. But there was something else, something in Bumpy's eyes that hadn't been there before. A stillness that made Illinois nervous. And Illinois wasn't a man who scared easily. "How bad is it?" Bumpy asked as they drove away from the rock. His voice was quieter than Illinois remembered, but there was an undertone to it, like distant thunder. Illinois had prepared for this moment for months. Intelligence reports, financial breakdowns, organizational charts, everything Bumpy would need to understand how completely his empire had been dismantled. But the prison grapevine was efficient. Bumpy hadn't been completely isolated for 11 years. He'd been receiving updates, processing information, planning. Illinois handed him a manila folder. Inside were photographs, financial records, newspaper clippings, 11 years of systematic dismantling documented in cold, hard fact. Luciano's got the docs, the policy banks on Lenox, most of the runners between 25th and 45th. Bumpy studied each page carefully. His expression never changed, but Illinois noticed his breathing had slowed. That was a bad sign. When Bumpy got very quiet and very still, people usually ended up very dead. But that was the old Bumpy. This new version, Illinois wasn't sure what he was capable of. "What about the people?" Bumpy asked. "Still remember you, still respect you, but respect don't pay rent, and Luciano's money spends just as green as anyone else's." Bumpy closed the folder, set up a meeting. "With who?" "Lucky." Illinois nearly swerved into oncoming traffic. "Boss, you sure that's smart? Man's got 200 soldiers between here and his office. You walk in there, you might not walk out." Bumpy looked out the window at the passing landscape. California was beautiful, but it wasn't home. Home was 1,500 miles east, and someone had been sleeping in his bed for 11 years.
"I'm not walking into his office," Bumpy said. "He's coming to mine." The next morning, a message was delivered to Lucky Luciano's office in Little Italy, hand-delivered by a 12-year-old boy, who disappeared into the crowd before anyone could ask questions. The message was simple, typed on plain white paper. "Mr. Luciano, I'd like to discuss our mutual interests in Harlem. Tonight, 9 p.m., Shed Josephine, Table 12. Come alone. E. Johnson." Lucky stared at the message for 10 minutes. The audacity was breathtaking. You don't summon Lucky Luciano anywhere. The choice of venue was deliberate, neutral territory, where violence was forbidden. The time meant hundreds of witnesses. Everything suggested Bumpy wanted this meeting to be public. Witnessed, remembered. Lucky's lieutenants went ballistic. This was an insult, a provocation, a declaration of war. Tony Torino wanted to burn down Shed Josephine. Salvatore DiMarco suggested sending 100 men to turn the meeting into an execution. But Lucky was curious. What kind of man makes that play? What kind of plan required a public meeting in neutral territory? Lucky had built his empire by understanding his enemies, by staying 3 steps ahead. This message represented a puzzle he couldn't solve. Shed Josephine was a jazz club in the heart of Harlem, owned by a Parisian woman who'd somehow managed to stay neutral in all the neighborhood's wars. The club's unspoken rule was simple. Violence at the door. Politics, business and blood feuds stayed outside. Inside there was only music, liquor, and conversation. Lucky arrived at exactly 9 p.m. He brought 12 men, positioned strategically throughout the club. Not obvious muscle, these were his smartest operators, men who could handle delicate situations without creating headlines. Lucky wore his best suit, a charcoal gray number that cost more than most people made in a year. He wanted Bumpy to understand what he was dealing with. Table 12 was in the back corner, dimly lit, with a clear view of both entrances. Lucky expected to find Bumpy waiting, probably nervous, maybe already drunk. Instead he found an empty table with 2 glasses of cognac and a note. "Mr. Luciano, please sit. I'll be with you shortly." Lucky's jaw tightened. This wasn't how meetings were conducted in his world. You showed up, you sat down, you talked business. You didn't play games with the most dangerous man in New York. But curiosity won over anger. Lucky sat. The jazz band was playing something low and smoky. Couples danced slowly near the small stage. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of whiskey and wine. Everything looked normal, but Lucky's instincts were screaming. Something was wrong. His men were too spread out. The exits were too far away. And where the hell was Bumpy Johnson?
At 9:17 p.m., the lights dimmed slightly. The band shifted into a new song. Something slower, more intimate. And then Lucky heard footsteps behind him. Not hurried, not threatening, just steady and deliberate. Bumpy Johnson walked around the table and sat down across from Lucky Luciano. The 2 men looked at each other in silence. Lucky saw what prison had done to Bumpy. The lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the way his expensive suit hung a little loose on his frame. But he also saw something else. A stillness that ran deeper than age. A calm that felt dangerous. Bumpy saw what power had done to Lucky. The confidence that bordered on arrogance. The easy assumption that he was the most important person in any room. But he also saw something else. A man who'd been winning for so long, he'd forgotten what losing felt like. "You look well," Bumpy said, lifting his cognac glass. "Success agrees with you." Lucky didn't touch his drink. "Let's skip the pleasantries. You wanted to talk. We're talking. What do you want?" "I want to understand something," Bumpy said. 11 years ago, when I went away, we had an understanding. You stay south of 11 10th Street. I handle everything north. Clean lines, no problems. But while I was gone, those lines got a little blurry. Times change, Lucky said. Markets evolve. You weren't here to service your territory, so I stepped in. Basic economics. Is that what you call it? Lucky leaned forward. "Look, Bumpy, I respect what you built here. But that was then. This is now. You've been gone 11 years. The neighborhood's moved on. The players have changed. The rules have changed. You can't just walk back in and expect everything to be like you left it." Bumpy set down his glass. "You're right. I can't expect that." Lucky smiled. This was going easier than he'd thought. Bumpy was being reasonable, realistic. Maybe prison had taught him something about accepting reality. "But here's what I can expect," Bumpy continued. And his voice dropped so low, Lucky had to lean in to hear him. "I can expect a man who claims to understand respect to show it. I can expect someone who talks about rules to follow them. And I can expect that when I ask politely for my territory back, a smart businessman will recognize a good deal when he hears one." Lucky's smile faded. "And if I don't see it as a good deal?"
That's when Bumpy said the 3 words that changed everything. "Ask Dutch Schultz." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lucky's hand froze halfway to his drink. His eyes locked onto Bumpy's face, searching for some sign that this was a bluff, a joke, anything other than what it sounded like. Dutch Schultz had been the most feared gangster in New York before Lucky took over. He'd controlled territories from the Bronx to Brooklyn, commanded armies of killers, had judges and politicians in his pocket. Dutch Schultz was untouchable. Until he tried to take over Harlem,
In 1933, Dutch had sent 12 of his best men to deal with a young upstart named Bumpy Johnson. 12 professional killers with a simple job: end the problem permanently. The next morning, 11 of those men were found in a basement, broken and bloodied. One walked out alive, carrying a message that made Dutch Schultz, a man who'd never backed down from anyone, decide that Harlem wasn't worth the cost. For 30 years, no one knew exactly what happened in that basement. The surviving man had been too traumatized to give a coherent account. The police investigation had been buried. The story had become legend, whispered in back rooms and spoken of in hushed tones. But everyone in the business knew the outcome. You don't challenge Bumpy Johnson in his own neighborhood. Now, sitting in that dimly lit jazz club, Lucky Luciano was being reminded of that lesson. The silence stretched between them. Lucky's men, positioned around the club, sensed the shift in atmosphere. Conversations at nearby tables continued, but the music seemed distant, muffled. Lucky could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "That was a long time ago," Lucky said finally. "Not that long," Bumpy replied, "and I haven't changed that much." Lucky picked up his cognac glass with a hand that was steadier than he felt. He was running calculations in his head. Bumpy was older, isolated, just out of prison, but he was also Bumpy Johnson. And the legend of what he'd done to Dutch Schultz's men wasn't just a story. Lucky had known 2 of those men personally. They'd been competent, experienced, dangerous, and they'd been destroyed by one man who refused to be intimidated. "What exactly are you proposing?" Lucky asked. "I'm not proposing anything," Bumpy said. "I'm telling you how things are going to be. You're going to pull your operation out of Harlem. All of it. The policy banks, the loan operations, the protection rackets, everything. You're going to do it quietly, professionally, with no hard feelings and no loose ends. And in exchange, you keep breathing." Lucky had been threatened before, dozens of times. By cops, by rivals, by ambitious underlings. But this didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a statement of fact, delivered with the same casual certainty you'd use to predict rain. "You think you can just walk back in here and reclaim everything?" Lucky asked. "You think 11 years in prison makes you stronger? You think I'm the same small-time operator you knew in 1952? Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "I think you're a smart man who's going to make a smart decision, because the alternative isn't negotiable." Lucky studied Bumpy's face, looking for weakness, for doubt, for any sign that this was desperation rather than confidence. He found nothing. Bumpy Johnson looked like a man stating a mathematical theorem, obvious and indisputable. The jazz band finished their song. In the brief silence before the next number, Lucky made his decision. "I need 3 weeks to wind down operations," he said quietly. "You have 72 hours. That's not realistic," asked Dutch Schultz. Lucky Luciano, the man who'd created the modern American mafia, who'd survived assassination attempts and federal investigations, who commanded an empire worth millions of dollars, nodded slowly. 72 hours, he agreed. Bumpy stood up from the table. He hadn't touched his cognac. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Luciano." He walked away without looking back, disappearing into the crowd of dancers and drinkers, as if he'd never been there at all. Lucky sat alone at table 12 for another 10 minutes, staring at the untouched glass of cognac, trying to process what had just happened. Within 72 hours, every Luciano operation north of 110th Street was shut down. Not violently, not dramatically, just efficiently closed and moved elsewhere. Lucky's lieutenants were confused, angry, demanding explanations. Lucky gave them none. He simply issued orders and expected them to be followed. Because Lucky Luciano understood something his men didn't. There are some battles that can't be won with numbers or money, or even violence. There are some men who operate by rules that exist outside normal calculations of power and risk. And when you meet one of those men, your only choice is to recognize reality and adapt accordingly. 3 words, asked Dutch Schultz. That's all it took to remind the most powerful crime boss in America that some territories belong to their kings, no matter how long those kings have been away. Bumpy Johnson reclaimed his empire without firing a shot, without spilling blood, without raising his voice above a whisper. He proved that true power isn't about what you can do to your enemies. It's about what they know you can do and what they've seen you do before. The story of that night at Chez Josephine became legend in its own right. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. No violence, no drama, no headlines in the morning paper. Just 2 men having a conversation, and one of them remembering why certain names are spoken in whispers. Lucky Luciano lived another 19 years after that night. He never again attempted to expand into Harlem. When asked why, he would simply say that some neighborhoods already had management, and good business sense meant respecting existing arrangements. Bumpy Johnson returned to his throne without a war, without casualties, without compromise. He ruled Harlem for another 5 years until his death in and for those 5 years, the neighborhood ran exactly as it had before he left, as if 11 years in federal prison had been nothing more than an extended vacation. Because in the end, that's what real power looks, not the ability to take what you want, but the ability to make others give it back without being asked twice. 3 words. That's all it took to remind everyone in New York's underworld of a simple truth. Kings don't abdicate. They just take temporary leaves of absence.